It's lovely to see Ann here. Ann's come from Melbourne to be with us tonight. And I thought we'd start, Ann, by finding out, I know this is an awful question and probably not one that you relish being asked, but was there such a thing as an Impressionist movement in Australia? I mean, I think of the Heidelberg School. Could that be defined as Impressionist or not?
Well, in my opinion, no, it cannot really. Largely because most of the people involved, or all the people involved in the Heidelberg School, hadn't ever seen Impressionist painting. And artists work really by looking at what's being done, what's being experimented and what's happening. They don't really work by reading about a movement and then somehow by osmosis doing it. So I would argue that the only Australian painters that got involved with Impressionism were those that went over to Paris, people like Phillips Fox and Russell, who saw the art and understood that something very different, something very radical was happening here, but they had to see it to understand it.
How do we define Impressionism? I saw one of those, I've just had a look at the exhibition myself, and on the wall I saw a comment by an art critic of the time who said words to the effect that Impressionists didn't render the landscape, they rendered a sensation of the landscape.
Yes, it's often described in those kind of terms as being such a visual sensation, not... well, really you can learn about Impressionism by walking through this exhibition, I'd say, because the early works there, which are not the Monet's contemporaries, early contemporaries, they're plein air paintings of recognisable scenes. And this is really how Monet starts. But as you walk through the exhibition, you'll notice it's a kind of loosening up, and he gets less and less interested in what he's painting, the subject. It can be anything. It can be just a boring field, just a single haystack. It's not what he's painting that's interesting, it's how he's painting it and what he's doing with the idea of colour and light. So that a journey through that exhibition, I think it's so good because it's such a representative show of Monet, really takes you on his journey, moving. He starts to drop using blacks and greys. He starts to drop the idea of trying to be, the idea of verisimilitude, trying to paint what's actually there. And he paints what he's feeling about this. And then he gets into colour and he's painting about, I mean, that wonderful haystack, if you've seen the central haystack at sunset, it's just a marvellous picture of these burning oranges and reds. And I mean, no one's ever seen a haystack like that at sunset ever. It would be on fire, if it'd be burnt if you saw it. It's all about his idea of colour and what he can do with it. Yeah. It's such a journey from the early representational plein air works.
So you say that Australian painters who went there to see what these people were doing were influenced and maybe maybe produced work of their own along these lines. And I want to find out about this John Peter Russell man, and in a moment his friendship with Vincent van Gogh. But first of all, who was John Peter Russell?
Yeah, well, he is a Sydney-sider, born here and of Scottish parentage, a big engineering family. Grew up here, was educated in Goulburn, and the father decided, my son's got to be an engineer like me, and he's sent off to do an apprenticeship in Lincoln. And then he comes back to Australia, and all of a sudden his father dies and leaves him a giant fortune. Now, while he's been away, he's had a little go at watercolour paintings. There are a few tiny little sketches of Lincoln Cathedral and little cautious little efforts. Suddenly, back in Sydney, he doesn't really want to be an engineer. He has all this money, so he can do what he likes. So he leaves immediately. Starts a train in Europe. He goes to the Slade in London, which was a very French-influenced, newish institution. And from there he goes for postgrad training to Paris, to this studio, Coumans. And of course that is where he meets Van Gogh.
What year are we talking about?
Well, he's born in 1858 and he enrolls at the Slade in London in 1881 and he's in Paris in 1884. He has about 3 or 4 years in Paris.
What sort of man was John Peter Russell? What I got the picture from reading your book of a gung-ho, masculine, can-do, physically active, strong sort of fellow. Is that right?
Oh, very much. He's a real he-man, really. He's quite quite competitive. He's very tall, strong, good-looking fellow. Wins an amateur boxing championship in London while he's there. He's a first-rate sailor, navigator. He loves sailing, horse rider, you know, all these things. And he also is a rower. And rowing had just sort of come into France in kind of the mid-century, and it was a bit of a fad. And the connotiers, they were known as, the sort of amateur rowers, and there were many of them. And Russell joins this a club actually at Bougival on the Seine, and he becomes a rower. And he writes about how he loves rowing and competing and all these kinds of things. He's the exact opposite, you might say, to someone like Van Gogh, really.
Was he a naturally gifted artist before he started looking and learning and going to studios and so forth?
No, I wouldn't say he was, actually. I think he had quite a struggle. If you look at the very early watercolours, the watercolours anyone do, if you read the instructions and got a little thing and then tried to do a little watercolour of your subject, he lacked confidence for a long time. But what he is very good at is drawing. He's a natural draftsman, a wonderful draftsman, and he's encouraged in this in his training in London and then in Paris. But because of being such a strong draftsman, he finds it quite difficult to actually no longer work in that way if you're going to become an impressionist, and that the line and form, of course, are dissolved by light, and you've got to let go of that. So he has a terrible struggle with that, actually.
So he's not driven from an early age to be a painter. He's not somebody who says, against any odds, I want to be a painter.
Well, there's so little documentation on him and hand letters, we don't know. But there obviously was always an interest there. There are family stories that his mother encouraged him to draw and said, why don't you become if you want to be an artist, be a portraitist. But the father was dead against it and offered no encouragement at all, so that he never had any particular training at school, no special lessons from the art master, and it was not encouraged at all from his background.
Now we come to the Dutchman Vincent van Gogh, who couldn't have been more different by the feel of it. I think all of us know the sort of mythology about Van Gogh. We know that he painted some iconic paintings that are now worth millions of dollars, and yet he only sold one painting in his entire lifetime. So he lived in poverty and all of that. But give me a picture of the background from which Vincent rose, and whether he was a man with prodigious talent from the word go.
Yes. No, again, no. His background, Russell came from quite a volatile background where people were always fighting one another, fairly angry, and most of the family didn't get on with one another. Van Gogh's background was upper middle class, well educated, came from a family of pastors, Dutch Calvinist pastors, and art dealers. A very loving family, couldn't have had a more secure upbringing. And his early years, one of his uncles gives him a way into the art dealing business, in which two of the uncles were involved in. And he has quite a successful, everyone likes him. He goes over to London and works with this firm Goupils, and they all think he's doing very well, and he's very cheery and happy there for quite a while. Does a few little drawings as a youth, and then when he moves from place to place, he likes to just sketch where he is and send a little drawing home to his mother. This is where I'm staying now and whatever. But things change for him. He falls in love with someone, the landlady's daughter, and he's rejected. And this seems to start a terrible spiral for him of feeling unworthy. So he goes and gives up he's sacked from his job because he's so melancholy. He decides to become a preacher, an evangelist. He goes to the Borinage and tries to help the poor miners there, which he does, works there for a couple of years. But he's sacked by the Calvinist authorities, evangelists, because he's too extreme. And he's at the lowest point of his life, really, and he's down there, no income, they don't want him anymore. And that's when he starts to draw. And there's a wonderful little letter, because he writes to his brother Theo regularly saying, I started to draw and I'm drawing the miners now. Look, all of a sudden things feel different for me. And from that point on, he becomes more and more obsessed with art, but he doesn't take the normal path of going to art school and learning how to draw and whatever. No. He's such an individual and so difficult. He teaches himself from various manuals, which is why he develops this amazing style of drawing, which I think everyone sort of notices, not like any other drawing in the 19th century. And it's because he's self-taught. And when he does eventually, get to Paris and go to a proper school there, he can't cope with this classical way of drawing and whatever.
Mm. So he meets John Peter Russell. Do they sort of hit it off immediately? They sound so different. They're not the sort of people that might seek out friendship with each other. Why did they become friends?
Well, I think they're in this same atelier in Montmartre, Courmans, and you all get around the model and you have sessions drawing the model, and then there's a break and you wander. And I think, walking around looking at each other's drawings, I think they became interested in each other's work.
Is this a school, an atelier?
Atelier. It's a studio.
Right.
The studio where they all go for till about 2 o'clock every day and draw from the model. And I think Russell is fascinated by his appearance because Russell's a bit older than the other students. He's doing engineering, etc. first. He's a little bit older. And so is Van Gogh. So they kind of have that in common. And the other thing they have in common is they both like an art which is old-fashioned at this time. That we're talking about 1886. If you've been to the exhibition, you would have seen some works by Millet, Jean-François Millet, the washerwomen and these sort of things. Well, Van Gogh just loved Millet. He thought he was a wonderful artist because he was an artist who understood the workers and the people. And Russell also liked Millet. So they were both of an older generation, and they both liked an art which no one else particularly liked at that stage. So they encouraged one another this way. And then, of course, Russell asks, can he draw Van Gogh's head? And the really exciting thing is that this drawing that he did, I think in the very early weeks that they knew one another, 5 heads on a large sheet of paper, that's in this collection. It's been bought by the Art Gallery of New South Wales a couple of years ago, and it's a wonderful thing to have because there were hardly any representations of Van Gogh. There's about 5 or 6 that we know of. And the only photograph of him is from the rear view. Very helpful.
Yeah.
So I think it started up with common interests in the studio, both struggling because they could see that they were very old-fashioned and out of it in what they were doing, and went from there.
Did these people at this atelier, did they know the Impressionists? Did they know Monet, for instance? Did Van Gogh know Monet? Did John Peter Russell know Monet?
Some of the younger students knew Monet, and of course you could see Monet. He was exhibiting quite regularly in Paris.
He was very successful, wasn't he?
At this
in his
point,
own time.
At this point, he's becoming successful. He's a very canny businessman, Monet, and so he doesn't just have one dealer. He has a selected dealers, and he sort of plays them off against one another. But at this particular point, 1887, 88, Theo Van Gogh was one of his dealers. Now, we don't know if Vincent went down to Giverny with Theo. It's not mentioned in the letters, so I doubt it. But he certainly would have seen the work. But Russell, John Peter Russell, actually does get to know Monet on a first-person basis.
Did they paint together at all?
The idea in the summer was when the studios closed down, you went off in the countryside for a couple of months and painted. And Russell went to this island called Belle-Île, which is in the Bay of Biscay off the coast of Brittany. He's painting away or having a nice time there with his beautiful Italian mistress and their little baby. And he thinks he's the only painter on the island, and all of a sudden one day he sees someone else there. And in Monet's letters, he's gone to Belle-Île too because he wants to do something fresh and not the Normandy coastline. And he said, there's been someone prowling around me as I work or something or other. Then he says, and then this fellow came up and said to me, are you Monet, the prince of the Impressionists? Well, of course, that was straight to his heart. He said, yes, matter of fact, yes. And so he allowed Russell to watch him work. Now, that's fairly unusual because he lived down in Giverny, and many people would have loved to have watched Monet work. There's a lot of American students down there and American residents down there, and he was forever kind of getting rid of them. He didn't want to be observed the whole time, but he did let Russell observe him. And I think it was an enormously important moment for Russell because he could see with Monet, with quite a different way of using the paint, with different brush strokes. He didn't have to actually follow the line of an object. He could paint and reflect light and colour, and the whole thing was very different. So it was a kind of, I think, a turning point for Russell.
Did his work change quickly after that?
Well, I note that he didn't seem to do any work that summer actually on the island, or none really exists. So I think he might have got rid of a bit of the early stuff he was doing. And from that point on, he starts to drop the heavy browns and blacks, and he talks a lot about his palette and wanting to purify it. And of course, he has this in conjunction with Van Gogh, who back in Paris is thinking, you know, I'm very old-fashioned too, and I have to really work at colour and understanding colour. And that's the story of the 2 years that Vincent's in Paris. It's all about coming to terms with throwing away all the old ideas about representation, using black, you know, careful form, and opening yourself up to painting colour and light.
Do we think of Van Gogh as an Impressionist?
Well, he didn't particularly like the Impressionists. He's in a sort of, being him, he's quite individual. Really, we can't quite classify him like that. He thinks they're a bit indefinite. And what he talks about is the way ahead. He says it's really drawing with colour. And if you look at his work, you know, you'll see that such strong brush strokes, but they're not their modelling form. They're in their own right. And so they're not a lot of colours used on each canvas, but it's the colour itself that makes the form, and it's not a kind of black and white modelling that went on earlier.
How long did the friendship between Van Gogh and John Peter Russell last?
Well, it's very short. That's why I called it remarkable. It's only short really because Van Gogh only had 8 years as an artist, and 4 of those years were in France, 2 years in Paris, 86 to 88, and then he goes down to Arles. Russell was in contact with him most of that 2 years in Paris, and then when he goes to Arles, they correspond. And Russell invites him to come and stay. Russell had by this time decided he's getting out of Paris too. He's going to settle on Belle-Île, and he builds a house there. And Vincent's interested to go, but of course doesn't. It's quite a long way, and a lot of train journeys to go from Arles right up to Belle-Île, and he doesn't have the money. And so he never gets there. So their correspondence is the link then. Van Gogh sends Russell a lot of drawings, some of which were reproduced in the book there, to show him what he's been doing in Arles. He's so happy in Arles in the sort of first 6 months there, and, you know, he writes in one letter to Theo, because he's been so melancholy and miserable so long, that I'm like a cricket basking in the sun here, painting and so on. It's a lovely little image, and about one of the few happy self-images we actually have of Van Gogh.
Do you think if we applied modern psychology to Van Gogh, he'd be described as a depressive? Or, I mean, would he be defined as someone who suffered depression all his life, for instance?
I think undoubtedly, and it ran in his family. One of his uncles became quite a severe depressive, and one of his siblings took their own life as well. And
didn't Van Gogh, I seem to remember I read in here that he encouraged John Peter Russell to buy or to have some of his works and to bring them back to his what he called his native country, which is Australia, didn't he?
Russell left Sydney with this idea that, you know, as he had money, he should also have be a patron and buy art, and he was quite pally with a man called Edward Coombs, who was the head of trustees in this gallery, and Coombs encouraged this sort of thing. So while he's in Paris, he does buy up works by Louis Anquetil, a whole little group of artists around that Cormons atelier. And with this Van Gogh sending him the drawings, and he also says, Van Gogh, when you're next in Paris, please go and take one of my canvases from Theo's studio. We'll have an exchange. But Russell doesn't go back to Paris for some 5 or 6 years after this. And in the meantime, of course, tragedy has enveloped Van Gogh.
Well, Van Gogh took his own life eventually, and that obviously ended the friendship. But was he lauded in his death by the public? Did he achieve?
No, not at all. Well, no. The depression, I think, was also accelerated by his background. He's a French Calvinist background. There's a doctrine of premeditation. And every time he failed at personal relationships or being an evangelist, all the things he failed at, he felt worse and worse. And his family kind of, you know, thinking, you know, that's the end of him. And I think he felt I think that's the real reason for he felt he could never come to anything, really.
In a sense, it's a tragedy, isn't it?
It's definitely a tragedy.
Do you see this friendship as a tragedy?
Well, no, but I think it's a tragic life. The friendship, I think... No, I don't. I think for Russell, it was a wonderful thing. Van Gogh gave Russell the confidence to take himself seriously as a painter. You know, he was a bit of... never had to sell, and he never exhibited, and he wasn't really finishing things at all.
It's amazing that Van Gogh only sold one painting in his life.
And that was to a fellow artist, a woman artist.
What was the painting?
It's called The Red Vineyard.
And John Peter Russell acquired a couple of Van Goghs, didn't he?
Yes, he did. But early on in the piece, when they were together in Paris, and so they were works that he'd done when he was before he got to Paris. So they were one drawing about at Eternity's Gate, a rather gloomy picture, and one painting of 6 pairs of shoes. There's a sort of still life that Van Gogh, he did a whole lot of studies of shoes as being, I think, really linked to Millet, as being emblems of the hard worker and the life lived, the clogs, around the fields and so on. It's not one of my favourite Van Goghs. It's now in the Fogg collection. In fact, I was working on the book, I could scream that that was the one he chose. Anyway, but at this point he hadn't seen the ones that Van Gogh had done in Arles, so he still had just the brownish, dark ones. And then, of course, he doesn't come to Paris to take one of the beautiful ones. He does see them at Theo's gallery, and he said, those ones that you've done in Arles are so much better than Gauguin's ones, actually.
Yeah. Was it a one-way thing, or do you think John Peter Russell had any influence on Van Gogh at all?
I would doubt that he had any, influence on his style, I think, really. But I think in terms of encouragement and support and fellowship, I think he was quite an important figure.
And Van Gogh valued the friendship, didn't he?
Well, Van Gogh was always wanting to make friends, and he tried very hard, but he was the most difficult man.
He sounds as if he was socially awkward. Is that fair enough?
Well, I think he was. Mariana, who was Russell's mistress, was appalled by him, and he'd come up to the studio, and there's an account where he's wants to see if Russell's there, and he's outside the window going, his hair, and she sort of screams and locks the door and won't let him in, and she thinks he's a madman. So there's a bit of... She's not mad about him at all. He was difficult. I think he could be a very true friend, though, and a very honest friend, and he would tell you what he thought. But the fellowship between the two was very important, because Russell is one of the few people that stayed by Van Gogh, and the friendship was never destroyed by, bad feeling, argument. Just about all the other friendships ended badly.
We're nearly out of time, but we should treasure Russell as a great Australian painter, shouldn't we?
Well, I think so. I think he's a wonderful painter, and you've got some great works here in the gallery, really.
Yeah, and the portrait that he did of Van Gogh, he did the drawings, but he also did an oil, didn't he?
He did an oil, a magnificent oil, which is actually on the cover of the book.
That's
right up there.
Yeah.
And that hangs permanently in the prominent position at the Van Gogh Museum, being one of the very few representations of Van Gogh. So they treasure it, and they were wonderful when I was working on the thing. They took it off the wall, they took it into conservation, and we did one of these infrared, looking at it, because I kept thinking maybe there's something else behind it, a different way or something other than we had a good look at it, but there wasn't. But anyway, at least we know.
So for the benefit of the people here who haven't seen the Monet exhibition, it's lovely to keep these thoughts in mind, because there's such a lot of work by him there, but the others that painted alongside him, or friends of his, like Degas, for instance, there's a Cézanne and so forth. It's a fabulous collection, isn't it?
Look, it's a beautiful exhibition, and those Antibes studies, which we know Russell saw, and Russell then 2 or 3 years later goes down to Antibes and paints exactly the same sites that you'll be looking at the exhibition here. It's fascinating.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anne.
It was a pleasure.
Would you please join me in thanking Ann Galbally?